They chained a child beneath the inn and called it mercy. The villagers never spoke of the cellar under the lantern's rest, not when the fog rolled in thick from the sea, or when the wind carried the sound of crying through the shutters. They drank, they lied, they prayed, but none of them ever walked down those stairs. Only Mira did, and only because she was too tired and too poor to believe in curses anymore. The night she heard the first sob, she was scrubbing the same beer-stained table she'd cleaned for 7 years, her fingers raw, her back aching from the weight of plates and unpaid debts. The inn smelled of wet wool and cold smoke. The hour past midnight when even ghosts sleep. She thought at first it was the wind squeezing through the eaves, but then came a second cry, thin, desperate, and heartbreakingly human. It rose from beneath the floorboards, a sound no storm could make, and it stopped her heart in its rhythm. She should have walked away. The landlord had warned her never to open the cellar door, said the foundations were rotting, said the sea had eaten half the stones, said anything at all to hide what lay below. But the cry came again, a small voice calling out between thunderclaps, and compassion outweighed common sense. Mira found the key hanging behind the counter, rusted and heavy, and carried a lantern down the corridor where the walls sweated with damp. The trapdoor at the end was older than the inn itself, carved from black oak, and bolted shut with an iron latch that had fused to the wood. She forced it open, the hinges screaming as if warning her back, and a breath of cold air swept upward, smelling of earth and iron. The steps descended into darkness that seemed alive, swallowing the lantern light. She saw her first movement at the bottom, a small figure huddled against the far wall, skin so pale it reflected the faint glow. Chains rattled as the figure stirred, and Mira raised the lantern higher. A girl, no older than 10, barefoot, shivering violently, her wrists bound in manacles too large for her bones. The child lifted her head, and the light caught her eyes. Silver, luminous, inhuman. For a moment, Mira thought she was staring into mirrors, and then she saw the faint glint of fangs when the girl's lips parted in a whimper. Terror bloomed, primitive and absolute, but pity bloomed faster. The child was thin to transparency, hair matted, lips cracked and blue. Someone had left her here to die. "Please," the girl whispered. Her voice was rough, scraped raw from disuse. "He'll smell you if you stay." Mira swallowed the rising fear. "Who will?" The girl looked toward the staircase, eyes widening. "The one who made the chains." Mira had heard enough tavern gossip to know what those words meant. There were old stories about the vampire king, the last of the ancient bloodline that once ruled the coastal kingdoms, buried somewhere beneath the cliffs after his court burned. The priest said his kind were all ash now. Yet the mark carved into the manacle, an iron moon wrapped in thorns, glowed faintly red beneath her lantern. It was the royal sigil from those stories, the sign of the Blood King's house. Mira's breath hitched. She should run. But the girl's voice broke again. A sob of pain so small and human, it anchored her where she stood. "It burns," the child said softly. "Please, I can't move anymore." Mira knelt beside her, every nerve screaming. The stone floor was ice against her knees. She reached for the shackle, but the moment her fingers brushed the metal, agony flared up her arm. She jerked back with a gasp, staring at the blistering mark that now bled across her palm, the same crescent thorn symbol that adorned the chain. The pain made her dizzy, but the sight of the girl's trembling hands steadied her resolve. She tore a strip from her apron, wrapped it around her palm, and gripped the manacle again. Smoke hissed between her fingers, the metal glowing, and with a cry she twisted until the link snapped. The sound echoed through the cellar like a bell. The girl slumped forward, gasping, free on one side. "What's your name?" Mira whispered. The child blinked, as if searching for permission to answer. "Lyra," she said at last, but he told me not to say it. "Well, Lyra," Mira murmured, "you're safe now." At that, the lantern guttered, its flame turning from gold to blood red. The shadows thickened, pressing close. The air grew heavier, full of the scent of rust and ash. From above came the slow creak of footsteps across the inn floor, measured, deliberate, impossibly heavy for any human tread. Mira froze. The girl's silver eyes widened with terror. "He's here," Lyra whispered. "The king." The words barely left her mouth before the lantern's glass shattered. Darkness poured over them like water. In the blackness, something moved on the stairs, a shape, vast and silent, descending. Mira snatched Lyra into her arms, clutching her close, feeling the unnatural chill of the child's skin seep into her own. The figure reached the bottom of the steps, and two crimson eyes opened in the dark. They were not glowing so much as burning, lit from within by centuries of hunger and grief. "Who breaks my law?" The voice filled the cellar, deep and calm, vibrating in her bones, more than in the air. Mira wanted to speak, but couldn't. The king's silhouette stepped into the faint red shimmer of the dying lantern, revealing a man, or something like one. Tall, robed in shadows that moved like smoke. His face was terrible and beautiful, carved from pallor, his hair black as the sea beyond the cliffs. Around his neck hung a shard of broken crown, and when he breathed, frost formed in the air. He looked from Mira to the chain dangling from the wall, then to the mark seared into her hand. "You freed her," he said. It wasn't a question. Mira found her voice, a whisper trembling between courage and madness. "She's a child. No one deserves chains." The faintest flicker crossed his expression, something almost human. Then the light died completely, and in that darkness, Mira felt the cold presence move closer, the breath of centuries brushing her cheek. The king's voice came again, softer now, almost curious. "And yet you touched the seal and lived. What are you, little mortal?" Mira clutched Lyra tighter, every heartbeat a drumbeat in the silence. "Just a waitress," she said, though she barely recognized her own voice. "Then tonight," he murmured, "the world has changed." Outside, the storm rose to a scream, waves battering the cliffs, as if the sea itself recognized the return of its master. In the cellar, Mira stood between the vampire king and his cursed daughter, unaware that the mark burning on her palm was already binding their fates together, that compassion had awakened a prophecy buried with the dead. The lantern flared once more, casting their shadows long against the walls, the monster, the child, and the girl who had dared to open the door. The storm had moved inland by morning, leaving the air heavy with mist that clung to the cliffs and crept into the inn through every crack in the walls. Mira sat by the dead hearth, the child wrapped in her wool shawl beside her, trying to make sense of the impossible night. The fire had burned out hours ago, but she hadn't dared to leave the girl alone long enough to fetch more wood. Lyra hadn't spoken since the moment the king appeared. She had fallen into a strange, feverish sleep, her small hands clutching the edges of Mira's sleeve as though letting go would drag her back into the dark. The mark on Mira's palm still throbbed, faintly glowing when she moved too close to the child. And every so often, she thought she heard whispers, curling around the edges of her thoughts. Voices not her own murmuring, in a language that tasted like ash. She told herself she was exhausted, imagining things. But when she glanced toward the cellar door, She could still feel the weight of unseen eyes lingering there. She should have run while it was still dark, taken the child, and vanished down the coastal road before the next tide. But some instinct, fear or fascination, held her fast. The hour was close to dawn when the air shifted. A prickle of cold brushed her neck, and the faint scent of smoke and iron returned. Before she could stand, the shadows in the corner thickened and drew themselves upward, gathering into the shape of a man. He stepped out of the darkness as if it were a doorway, and for the first time Mira saw him clearly in the gray light creeping through the windows. The king was beautiful in a way that defied reason, tall and slender, his skin so pale it reflected the faintest gleam, his eyes the deep, quiet red of banked embers. His clothes were soaked in rain, a black cloak spattered with salt, his boots whispering on the floorboards that seemed to shrink from his weight. He looked around the empty common room as though he were seeing a memory burned into the wood. When his gaze found her, Mira felt the air leave her lungs. "You defied me," he said, not angrily but as one stating a fact already written. His voice was low, ancient, threaded with a patience so absolute it was terrifying. "You touched the seal, you broke the binding, and you survived. That should not be possible." Mira's throat was dry, but she forced herself to speak. "If I hadn't, she'd have died." "Then you should have let her." His eyes flicked toward the sleeping child. "Her death would have been merciful. The chain was not only a prison, it was protection. You have no idea what you've done." "I saved her," Mira said, though her voice trembled. "That's all." Something unreadable passed through his expression, a flicker of emotion buried under centuries of restraint. "Saved her? You call this salvation?" He stepped closer, and the floorboards creaked beneath him. "Do you know what she is?" Mira held his gaze, though her hands were shaking. "She's a child." "She is my daughter," the king said softly, "and she carries within her a curse that has killed kingdoms. The chain bound it. You broke it." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Then chain me instead," she said, before she could stop herself. She didn't deserve it. The king stopped, his head tilting slightly, as if surprised. "You would offer yourself to replace her?" Mira hesitated, realizing too late what she had said, but the truth of it burned in her chest. If it would keep her safe. For the first time, the faintest hint of a smile touched his mouth, not amusement, but a sort of quiet disbelief, as if the notion of such defiance were foreign to him. He looked at her as though she were an anomaly, something that shouldn't exist. "Your kind once knelt at the mention of my name. You fear stories of me told by firelight, and yet you stand here, offering yourself like a priestess of old. Tell me, girl, are you brave or simply foolish?" "I'm tired," Mira said, surprising herself with the honesty of it. Too tired to be either. He studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching thin between them. Then, without warning, the child stirred. Lyra's eyes fluttered open, the silver duller now, the glow fading like a candle fighting wind. "Father," she whispered, voice fragile as frost. The king was beside her in a heartbeat, kneeling, his expression shattering into something raw and desperate. "Lyra!" He reached for her, but the girl recoiled, curling closer to Mira's side. The rejection struck him visibly, a tremor of disbelief crossing his features. "You fear me?" Lyra shook her head, tears gathering. "You smell like blood," she said, barely audible. The king's hand fell away. For a heartbeat, Mira saw not a monster, but a man carved hollow by guilt. He rose slowly, his gaze distant. "She is bound to you now," he murmured. "Your blood touched the seal. It recognized you. My power cannot break what has already chosen its vessel." Mira blinked, not understanding. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, turning toward the door, "that for as long as she breathes, you will never be free of her, or of me." He moved toward the threshold, and for an instant the light around him dimmed, as if the morning itself recoiled from his shadow. Mira followed without thinking. "Wait. Where are you going? What happens now?" He paused at the doorway, the storm's remnants swirling around him like smoke. "The council will come when they learn the chains are broken. They will not suffer a mortal who carries royal blood upon her skin. If you wish to live, you will come with me." "And if I don't?" "Then you will die here, and so will she." The simplicity of it left no room for doubt. Mira looked down at the girl's face, pale and still, then back to the king. Every instinct screamed that following him meant surrendering her life, yet staying meant something worse. She gathered Lyra into her arms and nodded once. The king's expression softened by the smallest fraction. He extended his hand. "Then come, little mortal." The moment Mira's fingers touched his, the inn dissolved into darkness. The world twisted, folding in on itself like a page turned too quickly. And when her vision cleared, they stood in a vast hall of stone that smelled of dust and old blood. Broken columns lined the walls, and moonlight streamed through shattered windows high above, painting silver patterns on the floor. The air was colder here, sharper, humming with power. Somewhere distant, a bell tolled once and fell silent. "This was the court of night," the king said, his voice quieter now. "What remains of it? Here we will decide whether your compassion was a blessing or a curse." Mira clutched Lyra tighter. "Why bring me here? Because the chain you broke binds more than you know. My enemies will come for her, and for you. If she dies, the last blood of my line dies with her, and with it, the balance that keeps the old magic asleep. You have tied yourself to a prophecy written before your birth." "I don't believe in prophecies," Mira said. "You didn't believe in vampires either," he replied, almost gently. "Belief is irrelevant. The bond is real." He moved toward the great doors at the end of the hall, his cloak whispering against the stones, and with a motion of his hand, they opened onto a balcony overlooking the sea. The horizon was pale, the first fragile light of dawn seeping through the clouds. The king stepped into it without flinching, though his skin seemed to shimmer faintly, caught between agony and awe. Mira followed, heart hammering, and saw below them the ruins of a kingdom built into the cliffs, towers half swallowed by rock, bridges leading nowhere, statues of long-dead monarchs staring blindly toward the ocean. "This is what mercy has cost us," he said, not looking at her. "The world thinks us monsters, and perhaps they are right. But once, long ago, we ruled with something like grace, until greed, fear, and love destroyed it all. Now, you have stirred the ashes." The wind lifted his hair, and for an instant, Mira saw the faint outline of scars along his neck, the marks of a crown that had burned too long. She wanted to speak, to ask what had happened to his queen, but the question caught in her throat. There was too much sorrow in the way he looked at the child. Lyra whimpered softly, and the king turned back, his eyes gentling. "She will need you until the bond fades. Feed her warmth, not blood. Sing to her when the moon rises. The sound will keep the curse dormant. Do you understand?" Mira nodded slowly, though none of it made sense. "And you? What will you do?" His gaze drifted toward the horizon. "I will try to keep the world from tearing you apart before you learn what you are." For the first time since the storm began, the clouds parted, and sunlight broke across the sea. It should have burned him, yet he stood still, watching it, as if remembering something lost. Once, he murmured, "My queen told me that the day the sun touched my face again would be the day our line found redemption. I thought she spoke in riddles. Now I think she was simply waiting for you." Mira wanted to deny it, to insist she was no one, but the warmth on her marked hand pulsed in answer, and Lyra's small fingers tightened around hers. The sea wind carried the scent of iron and roses, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of distant wings. "They know," the king said quietly. "The council knows she lives." He looked at Mira once more, and for a fleeting instant the mask of the immortal cracked, revealing a man afraid, not for himself, but for what he might lose again. "Run if you can, fight if you must," he said, his voice low and certain. "But whatever happens, do not let her cry alone." Then the sky darkened with shapes rising from the ruins below, and the first light of dawn bled into crimson. The ruin that the vampire king called his court had the stillness of a tomb, yet it lived and breathed in ways Mira could not understand. The air shimmered faintly, as though remembering voices, the walls pulsing with the slow rhythm of something ancient, slumbering just beyond reach. It was not built by human hands. The columns bled light when touched, the marble veins glowing like trapped starlight, and the shadows bent toward the king as if he were their source and master. Mira followed him through the echoing corridors in silence, Lyra pressed close against her chest, her small body trembling each time a sound broke the stillness. The king's steps made no noise. He moved as if gravity itself deferred to him, his cloak whispering against the stone like smoke drawn by wind. Mira was too tired to be afraid, yet fear lived in her blood now, steady as her pulse. The mark on her palm had begun to glow with a sickly silver light, pulsing faintly in time with the child's heartbeat. And each time Lyra whimpered, the burn beneath Mira's skin deepened. She tried not to look at it. She tried not to think of what the king had said, that the bond would not fade while the child lived, and failed. They reached what remained of the throne room. It was vast and empty. The roof long collapsed, so that pale morning light poured in through the broken archways, catching on shattered glass and half-buried mosaics that once depicted a line of rulers stretching back into myth. Mira felt the weight of ages pressing down on her, the kind of silence that had known both worship and slaughter. At the far end stood the throne itself, black stone, carved into the likeness of a winged creature crouching in perpetual grief. The king paused before it, his expression unreadable. "This is where it began," he said quietly, almost to himself, "and where it will end." He turned to Mira, eyes burning faintly in the dim light. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the cracked benches. "She will wake soon. When she does, she will hunger." Mira tightened her hold on Lyra. "You said not to feed her blood." "I did. She will crave it. But what she needs now is warmth, not flesh." He hesitated, studying Mira's face. "You carry both, though you don't yet understand what that means." Mira met his gaze, exhaustion sharpening her courage. "Then explain it." "You keep speaking in riddles about prophecies and bonds. What did I do to her? To myself?" The king walked toward one of the broken windows, the light drawing crimson reflections across his skin. The chains were woven with royal blood, mine and her mother's. When you broke them, your blood mixed with the residue of that binding. It recognized something in you, a trace of the same old magic. It marked you as kin, though you are not of our kind. Now the bond is sealed. Kin? Mira whispered. I'm not. No, he said, his voice cutting through her denial, soft but absolute. Not vampire. Something older. Your line may have forgotten what it was, but the blood remembers. The words lodged in her like splinters. She wanted to laugh, to call him mad, but the mark on her hand flared again, as if mocking her disbelief. Lyra stirred in her arms, murmuring incoherently, and the pain eased. The king watched the exchange with the wary fascination of a scientist observing a dangerous experiment. When my wife died, he said, turning away. The curse she carried should have died with her. But it was passed into our child instead. I sealed her in the cellar to contain it. The chain suppressed the curse, but drained her life. It was the only way to keep her from destroying herself. You broke the chain, and she lives, but the power is free now, wild, searching for equilibrium. It found you. Mira swallowed hard. You're saying I'm part of the curse. I'm saying you are the only thing preventing it from consuming her. The wind shifted through the ruins, scattering dust across the broken floor, and for a moment, the light dimmed. Lyra opened her eyes then, slow and wary, and Mira felt the pulse between them strengthen. The child's gaze flicked to her father. You came back, she whispered, voice small. The king dropped to one knee beside her, 1,000 emotions warring behind his composed face. Always, he said, reaching out. But Lyra drew back instinctively, pressing against Mira's side. The rejection struck him like a visible blow. You fear me still. No, the girl said, eyes welling with tears. You left me. Mira felt the tension between them stretch thin as wire. The king looked as though she had struck him, his expression hollowing into something too old and too wounded to be called human. I thought I was saving you, he said finally. The court turned against us after your mother's death. They said her blood was tainted, that the union with a mortal doomed our kind. When the fires came, I had to hide you. Lyra's fingers twisted in Mira's sleeve. The cellar was dark, she said quietly. I waited, and you didn't come. Mira wanted to look away, to grant them privacy, but neither moved, bound by a silence so heavy it seemed to pull the light from the air. The king's hand trembled where it rested on his knee. I failed you, he admitted, each word an old wound reopening. But she, his eyes lifted to Mira, she saved you when I could not. Lyra's gaze followed his. She sang, the child whispered. When it hurt, she sang. The king's breath caught. What song? Mira blinked, caught off guard. Just something my grandmother used to hum when I was small. I don't even remember the words. Sing it. She hesitated, but there was no mockery in his tone, only quiet urgency. Slowly she began to hum, the melody fragile and unfamiliar, rising and falling like a lullaby, half remembered from a dream. The moment the sound touched the air, the walls responded. The faint veins of light in the marble brightened, and a tremor ran through the floor. Lyra's eyes fluttered, her breathing steadying. The king's expression changed. Shock first, then something close to reverence. That song, he said, barely above a whisper, was forbidden to be sung after the queen's death. It was hers. Only the blood of the royal line could awaken its magic. And yet you... He stopped, the words failing him. I told you, Mira said softly. It's just a lullaby. He shook his head. No, it's older than you know. It was sung to bind, to soothe, to heal. It is the melody of the first mother, the one who gave our kind their immortality. The Queen learned it from relics older than the throne itself, and now you carry it. I don't understand. You will, he said, turning away, voice unsteady for the first time. In time. Before Mira could speak again, a sound like thunder rippled through the ruins. The king stiffened, every muscle coiled. They've found us, he said. The court has scented her. He crossed the hall in 2 strides, pulling from the air a blade that shimmered like frozen moonlight. They will come to test whether I am fit to rule, whether the rumors of a living heir are true. If they see you, they'll kill you both. Then hide us, Mira said. He gave her a long look, equal parts fury and disbelief. You speak to me as if I were your servant. You said it yourself. I'm the only thing keeping her alive. That makes me necessary. So hide us. For a heartbeat, the king looked ready to strike her, his eyes flaring with the old crimson fire. Then, to Mira's astonishment, he smiled, a thin, bitter thing. Very well, little mortal. He raised his hand, murmured words that slipped through her mind like smoke, and the air rippled around them. The world folded, and they were no longer in the throne room, but in a narrow chamber lined with carved symbols that glowed faintly blue. The walls hummed softly. This place is sealed from sight, he said. No one outside this room can sense you while the sigils hold. Do not speak, do not leave, and above all, do not sing. He turned to go, but Mira caught his sleeve. If you fight them, what if you die? He looked down at her hand, at the mark that mirrored his daughter's curse, and for a moment, something gentler flickered in his expression. Then you will already know, he said, and vanished. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mira sat on the cold floor, Lyra sleeping in her arms, listening to the distant rumble of voices echoing through the ruins. The sound of metal meeting metal reached her faintly, followed by a cry that might have been rage or grief. She held the child closer, whispering the first line of the forbidden lullaby under her breath before stopping herself. The mark on her hand pulsed in warning. When the noise faded, she thought he might not return. She thought perhaps the court had taken him, and that she and the child would be trapped here forever. But as the light began to fade from the walls, the air shifted again, and the king appeared, blood streaking his pale face, his blade cracked down the center. He looked more human than she had ever seen him, ragged, weary, and furious. They doubt me, he said, his voice low, shaking. They say I have been bewitched by a mortal. They will move against me before the next moon. Mira stood, her heart pounding. Then take her away. Hide her somewhere else. There is nowhere safe, he said. Not while she carries the blood of both worlds. But they will not strike yet. They will watch. They will wait for me to stumble. He looked at her then, truly looked, and the fury in his eyes was replaced by something heavier, almost sorrow. You don't understand the depth of what you've done. You have bound yourself to a dynasty that has devoured empires. You have become the vessel of its last hope. Mira shook her head. I didn't choose this. Neither did I, he said, and yet here we stand. He moved past her to the child, brushed a strand of hair from Lyra's face with fingers that trembled, and whispered something Mira could not hear. The sigils on the walls dimmed, the light bleeding away until only the faint glow of their marks remained. "Rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow we decide how to survive the court's mercy." When he was gone again, Mira lay beside Lyra on the stone floor, the air cold against her skin, and stared up at the carved ceiling where ancient words had been worn away by time. She did not know whether she feared the vampires outside or the bond inside her more, only that the world she had known had already ended. The lullaby haunted her still, circling her thoughts until it became almost a heartbeat. And somewhere beyond the sealed chamber, in the broken halls of the ancient court, the King of Shadows watched the horizon and wondered when the girl's courage would become his undoing. The nights grew longer in the ruins, or perhaps it only felt that way because the darkness there had a life of its own. The sea below the cliffs had turned black and silent, as if waiting for something to break the fragile truce between worlds. Mira could no longer tell how many days had passed since she'd freed the vampire child. Time in that place folded like the tide, pulling her forward and back with no mercy for memory. The king came and went like smoke, sometimes gone for hours, sometimes for entire days, returning only when the moon was high and his cloak dripped with rain and blood. He never said whose blood it was, and Mira never asked. Her duty, unspoken and absolute, was to protect Lyra, who grew stronger each night, but more restless, her silver eyes too bright, her skin too pale to belong to anything living. The child had begun to hum the lullaby in her sleep, the same tune that made the walls tremble and the mark on Mira's palm flare. Every time it happened, Mira felt a little less human, her veins glowing faintly under the skin, her reflection dimmer in the cracked mirror above the wash basin. She told herself it was the candlelight, but deep down she knew the bond was changing her. It was near midnight when the king summoned her to the old cloister. The hall was lined with statues that had once depicted saints, now eroded into shapeless faces, their eyes eaten away by centuries of salt and wind. He stood at the far end, cloaked in the pale light of the moon streaming through the broken arches. His sword leaned against the wall beside him, cleaned but not sheathed, a gesture of uneasy peace. When she approached, he looked at her with a weariness that made him seem suddenly mortal. "The court is dividing," he said without preamble. "Half still obey me. The rest whisper that the crown has fallen to madness, that I have surrendered our legacy to a human woman. They will not move openly yet, but they prepare for revolt." Mira kept her hands at her sides, though her heart pounded. "And what do you expect me to do about that? I'm no soldier." "You underestimate yourself," he replied. "The child lives because of you. The curse sleeps because of you. The song you carry has awakened magic I thought lost to dust. They will come to see you, whether you wish it or not. When they do, they must see something worth fearing. I don't want to be feared. Then you will be devoured." His tone was cold, but not cruel, the voice of someone too accustomed to blood to believe in gentleness. He paced a slow circle around her, studying her face. "They believe mortals are frail, that compassion is weakness. Show them they are wrong." Mira's laughter was short and bitter. "You speak as if I chose any of this. I was a waitress 2 weeks ago. I cared about bills, not prophecies." The king stopped behind her, close enough that she could feel the faint chill radiating from his skin. "And yet here you are, speaking to monsters as an equal." His breath brushed the back of her neck. Fate does not ask permission. It simply takes. Before she could answer, a voice echoed from the far archway. A woman's, melodic and cold. "And fate, my king, may take you as well." Mira turned. 2 vampires stood in the entrance, their armor black as obsidian, eyes glowing faintly. Between them walked a third figure, tall, slender, her gown the color of fresh spilled wine. Her beauty was unbearable, almost predatory, every movement calculated to draw attention. "Lady Saren," the king said softly, his voice unreadable. "I see even treason dresses elegantly now." The woman smiled without warmth. "Your Majesty wounds me. I come only to warn you. The council convenes tonight in the lower crypt. They will call for judgment. They claim the human has bewitched your heir, that her blood threatens the purity of our kind." "She threatens nothing," he said, his voice sharp as glass. "On the contrary," Saren purred, "she threatens everything. Already the old laws tremble. Already the chains of our order crack. Perhaps it is not her fault. Perhaps she is only a pawn, as you once were." Her eyes slid to Mira, lingering on the mark burned into her palm. "Or perhaps the curse that killed your queen has found a new vessel." Mira felt the air grow colder. The king's expression did not change, but the shadows around him deepened, gathering like a storm. "Leave this place," he said quietly, "before I remember that mercy is a human invention." Saren inclined her head, mockingly graceful. "Then you admit it. You are infected by it." She turned to go, her laughter trailing behind her like perfume. The soldiers followed, their armor whispering like dry leaves. When they were gone, Mira exhaled the breath she had been holding. "She's right, isn't she?" she asked softly. "I'm the reason they'll come for you." The king faced her, his eyes burning like twin embers in the half-light. "You are the reason my daughter breathes. If they come for me. But they'll kill her to punish you." He said nothing. The silence between them was answer enough. The following day, or what passed for day in that place, the king took her to a chamber beneath the cliffs. It was small, circular, lit by a single shaft of pale light that pierced the ceiling. The floor was carved with sigils, the same moon and thorn symbol that marked her hand, repeated in concentric circles. "This place was built before the first kings," he said, his voice reverent. "It was meant to house the orison, the spell that binds our kind to the dark. Few remember it now, and none have walked here since the queen died. But if you are to survive what comes, you must understand what you've become." He gestured for her to step into the light. Mira obeyed, every instinct screaming that this was dangerous. The moment her feet touched the inner circle, the air ignited. Silver light flared beneath her skin, racing along her veins like lightning. Pain tore through her chest, and she fell to her knees, choking. The king did not move. "Do not fight it," he said. "Let it show you." Images erupted behind her eyes, memories not her own. A woman with hair like winter light singing in a cathedral of shadows. A child born beneath an eclipse. A sword plunged into the heart of a dying sun. The visions shifted, becoming her grandmother's face, humming that same lullaby in a language Mira suddenly understood. For blood remembers even when names are lost. The light dimmed. She collapsed, gasping, the stone cold against her skin. The king knelt beside her, his face unreadable. "Now you know," he said quietly. "The song came from her, from the queen. Your grandmother must have carried a fragment of her line. When you sang, the blood recognized itself." Mira stared at him, trembling. "Then I'm part of her curse." "No," he said. "You are part of her redemption." Before she could reply, the ground shook violently. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the distant roar of the sea grew into a thunderous roar. The king rose instantly, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "They've breached the lower gates." "How?" Someone invited them, he said grimly. The wards only yield to royal blood, which means one of my court still loyal in name has betrayed me in deed. He offered her his hand. There's no time. Take Lyra and go to the upper monastery. It's warded by the queen's sigils. Only you can enter now. I will draw them away. Mira hesitated, the mark on her hand pulsing in protest. If you die, the bond will break and she will follow me into death, he said. So I won't die. He smiled faintly, a grim and terrible smile. You forget, mortal. I've already done that once. They found Lyra in the chapel, asleep beside the cold altar, the faint glow of moonlight painting her hair in silver threads. Mira gathered her up, whispering reassurances, though she was shaking too badly to believe her own words. The king opened a passage hidden behind the altar, a narrow stair spiraling upward into darkness. This will take you to the cliffs, he said. Follow the path north until the rocks bleed white. There you'll find the monastery. Say her name at the gate, and it will open. Mira clutched the child and looked back at him, wanting to speak, to thank him, to curse him for dragging her into this nightmare. But the words would not come. The king reached out, almost touched her cheek, then stopped himself. If I do not return by dawn, he said softly, do not look back. Then he turned, his cloak sweeping the dust into ghostly patterns, and vanished down the corridor, his sword already drawn. Mira climbed. The stairs seemed endless, carved through the very bones of the cliffs, lit only by the faint shimmer of her mark. Lyra stirred once, murmuring her father's name, but Mira held her close, whispering the lullaby until the child quieted. At the top of the passage, a wooden door waited, etched with symbols that flared to life at her touch. It opened onto the edge of the world, a narrow ledge overlooking the Black Sea. The wind so strong it nearly tore her breath away. She saw in the distance the faint outline of the monastery, its towers rising from the mist like teeth of bone. Behind her, thunder rolled again, not from the storm, but from the clash of forces deep below. She turned once, just for a heartbeat, and saw far below the ruins of the court lit in crimson fire. Shadows moved like armies across the cliffs. The king was there somewhere, holding back the tide. She wanted to believe he could win. But the wind carried the scent of ash, and she knew nothing that bled could fight forever. She started down the narrow path, the child's weight heavy but warm against her heart. The sea roared beneath them, the stars blurred by the rising mist. Each step felt like a prayer whispered to a god who no longer listened. By the time she reached the monastery gates, her strength was nearly gone. She spoke the queen's name, and the door opened on a breath of cold light, the sigils flaring like new stars. As she crossed the threshold, the bond between her and the king pulled tight, humming with pain, and she understood that wherever he was, he still lived. For now. The monastery door closed behind her, sealing her inside its ancient silence. She sank to her knees, Lyra sleeping against her shoulder, and let the tears she had been holding finally fall. Outside, the cliffs trembled under the weight of battle, and the first streaks of dawn touched the sea. It was not yet victory nor defeat, only the fragile stillness of a world poised between them. The monastery above the cliffs was not the refuge it seemed from afar. Its pale walls, veined with cracks and moss, exhaled the chill of centuries, and its bell tower leaned as if forever bowing to the endless sea. Mira crossed the threshold, carrying Lyra in her arms, every muscle trembling from exhaustion. The great door closed behind them with the sound of stone grinding against stone, sealing out the wind, but not the unease. The air inside smelled of old wax and dust, of prayers long forgotten. Candles burned in narrow alcoves, their flames trembling, though no draught touched them. A faint light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the floor with shards of red and gold. And for a moment, it almost seemed peaceful, but peace had no place in a world like theirs. The mark on Mira's hand pulsed faintly, as if reminding her that even within sanctuary, danger breathed beside her. Lyra stirred against her chest, her voice thin and fevered. "He's still fighting," she whispered, though Mira had said nothing aloud. "He bleeds, but he won't fall." Mira froze. She had not spoken the king's name, not since leaving the ruins, afraid it would summon more pain. But the child felt him, as if their hearts still shared a pulse. The bond between father and daughter ran deep as the sea, and through it, Mira sensed an echo of what the girl described: steel clashing, voices shouting in a language older than any prayer, the air thick with smoke. The vision struck her so suddenly she staggered, clutching at a marble pillar to stay upright. When the haze lifted, she was standing in the chapel at the heart of the monastery, a circle of faint light spilling from a rose-shaped window above the altar. The queen's sigil, moon and thorn intertwined, was carved into the stone floor. As Mira stepped into its glow, the mark on her hand flared brighter, a thin silver flame. Something stirred in the shadows near the altar, a low, rhythmic sound, like breathing. Mira stiffened, drawing Lyra close, but before fear could take root, a soft voice spoke, a woman's voice, hollow yet melodic. "At last, the blood returns." From the darkness stepped a figure wrapped in robes the color of smoke. Her face was ageless, her eyes gray as mist. She carried a staff carved from bone, topped with a crystal that glowed faintly at Mira's presence. "You bear her mark," the woman said, stepping closer. "I have waited for the one who carries the queen's song." Mira's throat tightened. "Who are you?" "The last of her sisters," the woman answered. "When the queen was taken by flame, I was charged to guard her echo. The blood that passed into the mortal world was never meant to return, yet here you stand, half bound, half free. The circle completes itself." "I don't understand," Mira said, though exhaustion made the words slur. "You will," the woman said, "but there is little time. The king fights to keep his crown, and even if he wins, the council will not forgive his defiance. They will strike here next. You must finish what she began before they come." Mira shook her head. "I can't. I don't even know what I am." "You are the bridge between the living and the damned," the woman said simply, "and the bridge must stand, or both sides will drown." Lyra stirred again, her small voice a whisper. "It's hurting him." The priestess's gaze flicked toward the child. "The bond cuts both ways. He bleeds, she feels it. If he dies, she dies, and the balance collapses. You are tied to both. You must use the song to bind the rift before the blood eclipse rises, or the curse will devour you all." Mira swallowed hard. "Then tell me what to do." The priestess extended her staff. "Sing. The words will come when you need them. They always do for those who remember mercy." Mira hesitated, then nodded. She closed her eyes, drew a breath, and began to hum. The melody was the same one her grandmother had sung, but it changed as it left her lips, unfolding into something vast and sorrowful. The walls trembled. The light from the window flared, filling the chapel with a blinding brilliance. Beneath her feet, the sigil blazed to life, its lines crawling outward like roots seeking soil. The queen's voice, ancient and resonant, joined hers, echoing through the stone. Images poured through Mira's mind. The queen kneeling before a burning throne, the king weeping as he sealed his daughter away, the curse twisting through their veins like a storm. And through it all, the same words repeated. Blood remembers, love redeems. The light dimmed. Mira opened her eyes to find the priestess kneeling before her, head bowed. "It is done," she said, voice trembling. "You have awakened the queen's sanctuary. No creature of shadow may cross these walls without your permission." Before Mira could speak, a deafening roar shook the ground. The candles guttered out. Dust rained from the ceiling. Lyra clutched at her, eyes wide. "He's falling," she gasped. The child screamed, a sound so raw it split the air. The mark on Mira's hand flared again, brighter this time, burning so fiercely that she could see her bones through her skin. She dropped to her knees, clutching the child, and the world tilted. Through the haze she saw flashes of battle, figures in black armor, flames rising, the king on his knees, surrounded by enemies. She felt his pain as if it were her own, the weight of centuries pressing into her chest. The priestess's voice came faintly through the din. "The bond pulls you to him. If he dies, it will tear you apart. You must choose. Stay here and protect the child, or go to him and risk the curse consuming you both." Mira forced herself to stand, still shaking. "If I go, will she be safe?" The priestess looked at Lyra, whose eyes glowed now with the same burning silver that had once bound her chains. "She carries the queen's light now. The sanctuary will obey her, as it does you. Go. The bond will show you the way." Mira kissed Lyra's forehead, whispering, "Don't be afraid." Though her own voice broke, the child's fingers clung to her sleeve. "He'll die if you don't," Lyra said quietly. Mira nodded once, then turned toward the door. The wind howled outside, heavy with salt and thunder. The path back down the cliffs had vanished into fog, but the mark on her hand pulsed, pulling her forward. She ran. The sea below was a black mirror, reflecting flashes of fire from the ruins below. The air reeked of blood and ozone. When she reached the lower cliff path, she saw them, the council's soldiers, pale and faceless, moving like a tide toward the king's court. Their eyes burned with cold flame. In their midst, Saren walked untouched, her crimson gown whipping in the wind. At her throat glimmered a shard of silver that Mira recognized, a fragment of the queen's crown. "Foolish king," Saren's voice carried even over the storm, "you traded eternity for a mortal's pity." Mira did not think. The song rose in her throat again, unbidden, carried on the wind. The soldiers froze, their steps faltering. The ground beneath them cracked, lines of light bursting through like roots of lightning. Saren turned, her eyes narrowing. So the little waitress thinks she can wield the queen's magic. The air trembled. Saren lifted her hand, and shadows coiled around her fingers, forming a blade of darkness. Mira stood her ground, every instinct screaming to run. The song changed, deepening, and the light around her solidified into a shield. The first blow struck, shattering against it with a sound like thunder. Pain lanced through Mira's chest, but she kept singing. The melody grew louder, more desperate, the storm itself bending toward her voice. At the heart of the ruins, the king rose again. His armor was cracked, his face streaked with blood, but his eyes burned with a fury that no death could tame. When he heard the song, he faltered, disbelief breaking through his exhaustion. "Mira," he breathed, as if her name itself were a prayer. The tide of soldiers turned toward the sound, and he seized the moment. His sword ignited with crimson fire, and he cut through them like a shadow through mist. Saren's scream echoed through the cliffs. "You will undo us all!" she cried, and hurled the crown fragment toward Mira. The silver shard struck her shoulder, burying deep, and the song faltered. Pain erupted, white-hot, but instead of silencing her, it split the melody into two voices, hers and the Queen's. The ground beneath the ruins split open, and light poured out, consuming shadow and stone alike. Saren fell to her knees, shrieking as the magic turned against her, burning through her like sunlight through glass. When the storm cleared, silence fell. Mira stood trembling, blood soaking her arm, the wound where the crown had pierced her glowing faintly. The king staggered toward her, his sword falling to the ground. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice raw. "You'd have died if I hadn't," she answered. He reached her, his hand brushing the mark on her palm. "And now, you've taken the curse into yourself." She felt it then, the darkness curling through her veins, the same hunger that lived in his kind. Her skin was pale as moonlight, her eyes reflecting silver fire. The bond between them throbbed, alive, binding tighter with each heartbeat. "If it means she's safe," she said quietly, "then let it take me." The king's expression broke, the centuries of control shattering like glass. "No," he said. "You don't understand. Your death would end us all. The curse must be sealed, not fed." He pulled the crown fragment from her shoulder, pressing it against his own chest. The metal hissed, smoke rising as it seared his skin. "Blood answers blood," he whispered. "If one must bear it, let it be me." Mira tried to stop him, but the bond flared, holding her still. Light burst from the wound, spreading through the ruins like dawn breaking underwater. The shadows retreated, the soldiers dissolved into mist. Saren's body crumbled to ash. The king fell to his knees, his skin blazing with the same silver fire that had once marked Mira's hand. She caught him as he collapsed, his breath shallow, his eyes reflecting her face. "You can't take it all," she said through tears. "I can," he whispered, "because you showed me how." His blood, luminous and strange, stained her hands as he pressed them together. The mark on her palm faded, splitting into two halves, one on her skin, one on his. The air was heavy with the scent of iron and roses. Then the fire dimmed, leaving only silence and the faint echo of the song, still resonating through the cliffs. Mira knelt there long after the last light died, the king's head resting against her shoulder, her tears falling on the cold stone. Above them, the first fragile rays of dawn broke through the clouds, touching the sea with pale gold. In the distance, the monastery bells began to toll, slow and mournful, as if the world itself were holding its breath between death and rebirth. The dawn that rose above the cliffs was pale and fragile, a hesitant light spreading across the ruins of the vampire king's court, as if the sun itself feared to touch the place. Smoke curled upward from the shattered towers, mingling with the mist that clung to the sea, and the air still trembled with the memory of battle. Mira sat motionless beside the king's body, his head resting against her lap, her blood-stained hands cradling him, as though the warmth of her touch could summon life back into his still frame. His skin, once radiant in its coldness, had turned to marble, a faint shimmer of silver tracing the veins at his throat. The mark on her palm, which had once burned with living light, now lay dormant, a pale scar, yet she could feel the faint pulse beneath it, the echo of him, the whisper of something unfinished. She had thought the storm's end would bring silence, but silence was never empty in places haunted by power. The sea below moaned like a wounded creature, and the wind that swept through the ruined arches carried whispers, in voices not entirely of the living. Lyra's name drifted through them again and again, soft as prayer and sharp as warning. Mira looked toward the path that wound back to the monastery, half hidden by fog. The child was safe, she told herself, guarded by the Queen's light, yet the certainty faltered with each heartbeat. The world had changed the moment the king's blood mingled with hers. She could feel it in the air, the way the shadows bent differently, the way the light trembled instead of burning. It was as if all creation were holding its breath. The first drop of blood fell from her hand onto the stone and spread like ink. The ground beneath her shifted, and the faint vibration grew into a hum, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. The king's eyes flickered open. They were no longer red, but the same molten silver that glowed in Lyra's, and the sight of them filled her with awe and terror all at once. His breath caught, shallow but certain, and when he spoke, his voice was both his and something far older. "You should not have stayed," he murmured. "The curse was meant to die with me." Mira's fingers trembled as she brushed a strand of hair from his face. "And leave you to bear it alone? You forget, my lord. I am bound to you now." His lips curved faintly, though the expression was full of pain. "I remember everything," he said. "That is the curse. The blood remembers what it loses and what it steals." He tried to rise, but the effort sent a tremor through his entire body. Light flared under his skin, veins burning with alternating gold and crimson. "It's not finished," he whispered. "The court will not rest until the old law is restored. They will come for the girl and for you. I must end it before they do." "You're too weak," Mira said, her voice low but steady. "You'll die if you move again." He laughed softly, the sound hollow. "I have died 1,000 times. In battle, in dreams, in memory. What is once more?" He looked toward the rising sun, its light creeping across the shattered stones. "Do you feel it? The world shifts. My kind were never meant to see this dawn, and yet here it is. You've broken something that cannot be rebuilt." Mira followed his gaze. The sunlight did not burn him. It touched his face like warmth instead of flame. She felt it too, the strange gentleness of it, the warmth that carried no pain. For the first time, the line between light and shadow had blurred. "Maybe it isn't broken," she said softly. "Maybe it's healed." Before he could answer, a low rumble shook the ground. From the sea below, mist began to rise, coalescing into shapes, figures of darkness and bone, the remnants of the council slain in battle. Their eyes burned with the last embers of hatred. "He defied the oath," they whispered as they climbed the cliffs, voices like the scraping of knives. The blood betrayed the dark. The king forced himself upright, though his wounds reopened with the motion. "They come to claim what's left of me," he said. "And if they find you, they'll take more than blood." "Then they'll find us both," Mira said, standing beside him. "I won't run." He looked at her with something like grief. "You should. You were never meant for this world." "I wasn't meant for yours either," she answered. "And yet, here I am." The first of the wraiths reached the ruins, their forms half real, half shadow. They circled the pair, their voices rising in a chorus of accusation. "He gave the light to flesh. He turned the eternal into mortal. The balance is undone." The king raised his hand, but the energy that gathered in his palm flickered weakly. The curse within him was eating away what little remained of his power. Mira felt the pull of the bond between them tighten, drawing strength from her veins into his. The pain was excruciating, yet she did not pull away. "Take what you need," she whispered. He looked at her, horrified. "You'll die." "Then I'll die doing something that matters." The light between them flared, brilliant and terrible. The wraiths shrieked, their forms unraveling in the glow. The ground beneath the ruins split, revealing the sea boiling with light beneath. It was not water anymore, but molten radiance, the raw pulse of magic once buried in the depths of the world. The wraiths fell into it, their voices fading one by one until only silence remained. When the last of them vanished, Mira collapsed, her body trembling violently. The king caught her before she struck the ground, cradling her in the crook of his arm. The light in her veins dimmed, replaced by a faint shimmer of gold. "You've given too much," he said, his voice breaking. "You've tied your life to mine completely. There's no undoing it now." She managed a weak smile. "Maybe that's what your queen wanted." "Not an end, but a beginning." His expression softened, and for the first time in centuries, tears welled in his eyes. "You speak as she did," he whispered. "She believed love could change the nature of blood." I called her a fool. "Then we're both fools," Mira said, her hand finding his. The sun climbed higher, flooding the ruins with light. The king's body shimmered, his shadow fading. The curse that had defined his existence for centuries was unraveling, and in its place, something new was forming. Neither mortal nor immortal, neither darkness nor dawn. He looked down at her, his face illuminated by the golden glow. "If I stay," he said, "I become something else. No longer king, no longer vampire. The court will not follow me. They will need a new law, a new order. Will you stand beside me if we live?" Mira closed her eyes, her voice barely audible. "I already do." The bond flared one last time, filling the air with blinding brilliance. For a moment, the ruins vanished, replaced by a vast field of light stretching to infinity. In that space, she saw everything: the queen's sorrow, the king's pride, the long chain of mistakes and sacrifices that had led to this dawn. And at the heart of it all, she saw the child, Lyra, standing at the edge of the sea, her eyes shining like stars. The light that poured from the girl's hands spread outward, touching every shadow in the world. The sun blazed fully, no longer afraid, and the old night died with a sigh. When the light faded, Mira and the king stood alone at the edge of the cliffs. The sea below was calm, its surface reflecting the first true sunrise in 1,000 years. The ruins behind them had transformed into pale stone and blooming vines, the scars of battle replaced by growth. The king turned to her, his eyes no longer glowing, but clear and human. "It's over," he said softly. "Not over," Mira replied. Changed. He reached for her hand, and where their palms met, the twin marks merged into one, a faint scar shaped like a crescent moon cradling a drop of blood. "This will be our law," he said. "Not fear. Not hunger. The bridge stands." Far away, the monastery bells rang again, their notes clear and triumphant. The world, once divided by light and shadow, began to knit itself whole. The child would grow under the sky that no longer burned her. The king would rule a realm reborn from ruin, and Mira, once a poor waitress, would be remembered as the mortal who taught eternity the meaning of mercy. The sea sighed below, endless and forgiving, and the wind carried the scent of dawn across the cliffs. The king turned his face to the sun, and this time he did not hide from it. He took Mira's hand, their shadows falling together across the brightening stone, and for the first time in history, night and day stood side by side and did not fear each other. The days that followed the storm were unlike anything the kingdom had ever known. The sky, once a shroud of ash and endless twilight, softened into color for the first time in centuries. The sun rising without burning, the moon setting without fear. The ruins of the vampire court stood transformed, the stone no longer bleeding shadow, but covered with flowering vines that drank both light and darkness without distinction. The sea at the foot of the cliffs turned clear, reflecting the morning sky like liquid glass. It was as if the world itself, long held in mourning, had taken a slow, shuddering breath and remembered how to live. Mira walked through what remained of the hall where she had first seen the king. The throne, cracked and half sunken into the earth, now gleamed faintly with the light of dawn, its once black surface veined with gold. She brushed her hand across the cold stone and felt it thrum faintly beneath her touch, the echo of blood and magic resting finally at peace. The mark on her palm, the crescent and drop that had bound her to the curse, had faded into a pale scar that neither burned nor pulsed. It was only a memory now, a reminder of what had been paid for this new world. Lyra was waiting by the archway, her bare feet leaving faint impressions in the dust. The child no longer trembled at sunlight. Her skin glowed with the same faint warmth that Mira's did. She was neither human nor vampire anymore, something gentler and stronger, born from both. When she smiled, the ruins seemed to brighten. "He's calling you," she said, her voice carrying the serenity of one who had known both death and rebirth. Mira followed her gaze toward the cliffs. The king stood there, dressed no longer in the black of mourning, but in a simple cloak the color of the sea at dawn. His eyes, once red as embers, had turned gray, still ancient, still fathomless, but touched now with something unmistakably human. Mira joined him, and for a long moment they stood in silence, watching the light dance across the water. "The court has gone quiet," he said at last. "Those who survived have scattered. Some may never return. Others wait, uncertain, watching to see what I have become." "You've become what they were too afraid to be," she said softly. "Alive." He turned to her, the faintest hint of a smile curving his lips. "Alive," he repeated, tasting the word as if it were new. Once, that word had meant hunger and fear. Now it feels like a promise. His gaze drifted toward the horizon. The balance has shifted. The old laws have broken, and the night no longer owns us. But the dawn, too, must learn restraint. If the mortals learn what happened here, they may not see it as salvation. They may call it blasphemy. Then we'll show them otherwise, Mira said. Not through war, through peace, through what we've already done. He regarded her quietly. "You speak as if peace were simple." "It isn't," she replied, "but neither is love, and you found your way back to that." The words hung between them, fragile and true. The king's expression softened. "When I first saw you, I thought you were a child of mercy. Fragile, foolish, easily broken. I thought compassion was the weakest of virtues. Now I see it was the only one strong enough to break our chains." Mira looked out over the sea, where the light shimmered across the waves. "Then keep it," she said. "Build your world on it." He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing the faded scar on her palm. "And you? Will you stay?" "I haven't decided," she admitted. "Part of me wants to see what becomes of this world, now that it's no longer ruled by fear. Part of me wonders if I even belong here anymore." "You belong where you are needed," he said, "and whether you stay by my side or walk among your kind again, the bridge remains. The bond between worlds will not fade." A silence followed, deep but not heavy. The sound of waves filled it, steady as breathing. Mira turned toward him, and for the first time, she saw not a king or a monster, but a man standing between night and day, as uncertain and as hopeful as she was. From the monastery above, the bells began to ring, their notes carried on the wind. Lyra's laughter echoed down the cliffs, light and untamed. The child ran toward them, her hair catching the sun, her feet sure on the stones that had once been soaked in blood. When she reached Mira, she caught her hand and held it tight. "It doesn't hurt anymore," she said with a small smile. "The world feels soft now." Mira knelt beside her, smoothing a lock of silver hair behind her ear. "That's because it's healing. You helped it remember how." Lyra looked up at her father. "And you?" He gazed at the horizon. "I am learning," he said quietly. "Learning to rule without fear, to exist without hunger. It is slower than I thought." Lyra grinned. "Then you'll have time to get it right." The king laughed, a sound that seemed to startle even him. It was a quiet, human laugh, free of echo or edge. The sound carried across the cliffs, and for a moment, even the sea seemed to still and listen. Mira rose, standing beside him again, her heart full and strange. "So what happens now?" she asked. He looked at her with that new softness in his eyes, the weight of eternity no longer pressing behind them. "Now," he said, "we live, not as rulers or saviors, but as witnesses. The world will write its own laws, and perhaps someday it will forget us. That would be its greatest gift." Mira nodded slowly, letting the wind tangle her hair. Forgetting had once been her greatest fear, but now she understood that memory was not what kept people alive. It was what they left behind, the light in others, the courage to act when no one else dared. She had been a waitress once, small and invisible, a girl who counted every coin and every hour. Now she had touched immortality and taught it to kneel. There was nothing more to fear. The sun climbed higher, the shadows of the ruins shrinking until they were swallowed by light. Flowers had begun to bloom along the edges of the cliffs, pale blossoms with petals like moonlight, growing from cracks in the stone. The king bent to touch one, his expression thoughtful. "They say flowers like these grow only where blood has sanctified the earth," he said. "Then they're proof," Mira replied, "that nothing sacred ever truly dies." He stood, facing the sea, and she knew he would stay there for a long time, watching the horizon, rebuilding a kingdom not of walls, but of vows. Mira turned back toward the monastery path, Lyra's hand in hers. The bells still rang, slow and steady, marking not the end, but the beginning of something unnamed. As they walked, the breeze carried with it the faintest echo of the Queen's song, no longer a lament, but a hymn of release. The cliffs, the sea, the sky, all sang it together, and for the first time since the world was divided, the melody belonged to both darkness and dawn. Mira looked once over her shoulder. The king stood where she had left him, the sunlight wrapping around him like a crown that did not burn. She smiled, not in farewell, but in promise, then turned away, her steps light upon the healing earth. The sea stretched endlessly before her, the horizon gleaming with the promise of new days. And as the morning grew brighter, the last traces of night folded quietly into light, leaving only peace, and the sound of waves carrying her song into eternity.